All right, this is a very long abstract, so I'm probably just going to start and begin right away. It begins with a little bit of a history lesson. So, after the Manhattan Project developed the first ever nuclear weapons during World War II, top physicists and scientists of many disciplines collaborated during the 1950s to produce the first nuclear energy systems that utilized the same immense power contained in atomic bombs once used to annihilate cities, to instead provide humanity with seemingly limitless energy. Ever since its invention, nuclear energy has been a controversial and polarizing energy source with many prominent proponents and detractors from politicians to environmentalists. Negative public perception of nuclear energy following notable incidents such as Chernobyl and Fukushima, and misleading information on nuclear waste, and gross ignorance with respect to the particulars of nuclear technology have only served to widen that divide. However, in a modern world that increasingly relies on electric power, and in a world where environmental, political, ecological, and economic factors have made other major sources, from fossil fuel hydrocarbons to solar energy, more unreliable or undesirable, nuclear energy presents itself, instead, as an ideal solution to the current energy crisis and inevitable energy crossroads modern civilization will face. This is due to its superiority over other common sources in a variety of important areas, such as consistency and energy density, especially the areas that have increasingly made competing sources more undesirable, such as carbon footprint, pollution, and cost. Surprisingly, the superiority even extends over competing sources in areas of perceived weakness, such as safety and extent of pollution. In addition, the potential opportunity for the development of new technology such as molten salt reactors and modular reactors makes nuclear an even more tantalizing option as time moves forward. It is for all these reasons that nuclear energy should be the chosen workhorse for the American power grid by 2050 at the latest.
First of all, I want to say that your paper was very excellently written.
Thank you.
I feel like I was reading a college level paper. Your abstract was great. And I should have just read the whole thing at once because I started writing all these questions and then you answered them eventually. So you're very thorough in your research, I can tell. And it seems like you're very knowledgeable about this. So I really, before this, I had no idea that nuclear energy was even an option.
Yeah.
So I was very ignorant concerning energy sources because, the media right now is, I think, focusing on all the other energy sources that
they are
argued against. But anyways, I just want to say that first off, that it was a very well written paper. And
thank you.
I learned a lot from it.
I echo Mrs. Song's thoughts. I think you did good research. Your presentation was well structured. You could have gone a little slow in your abstract.
I'm sure.
Okay.
I wrote way too much down. I was aware this was the only thing I got to read, so I put too much information in it. So.
No worries about it. You did a good job on the paper.
Well, I think you were so thorough with, educating, like what are the current power sources that are used and like the cost and everything. So I guess one of the main things I came away with is why don't more of us know about this nuclear energy? Honestly, I didn't have any idea that was actually a possibility. And I think what you mentioned in your paper was all I think back to is Hiroshima and all the big things that happened surrounding nuclear energy, right? So, but with that said, can you appreciate why people are very hesitant with nuclear energy? Just the word nuclear just sounds scary. Right?
Absolutely. Nuclear devices are the most powerful energy sources we've ever developed. Nuclear weapons are obviously the most destructive things humans have ever invented. So it doesn't come as a shock to me that emotionally we can relate the two things. You're like, oh, you have nuclear weapons that can level cities in a blink of an eye. And then you have, oh, this power system uses the exact same technology, or at least people who don't understand how the technology works would make that connection that, well, A equals B. So you have that, and then also there have been examples in the past where it has gone wrong, and it was very frightful when it did happen. So, but the reason that it sticks around is that the context of those situations was never fully explained or educated to everyone. And obviously you had people got swept up in massive movements like the denuclearization efforts in the 60s and 70s that were part of the whole peace movement. It all got tied into that same wave of platforms, and that's kind of how we ended up with where we are today. And you see more recently in 2011 when Fukushima Daiichi happened in Japan, you had countries like a lot of the countries in the EU, most notably Germany, very prominently and vocally denounced the use of nuclear power systems and began immediately denuclearizing their countries. And that was kind of a knee-jerk reaction. Obviously, there are circumstance, I explained in the paper, I don't want to talk too long here for all the reasons why it was as bad as it was, but I would say those are probably the reasons why people see it that way.
And you did explain very well how, like, there are some safety measures, like with the molten salt reactor
Yes.
that you talked about. Like, there are ways that we can diminish, like, the risks with
Mhm.
nuclear energy. But so I guess morally, like the good technology in the wrong hands can go really
Mhm.
bad, right? So
Absolutely.
I think for me personally, that's what I think of when I think of nuclear energy. Well, okay, this is really good, but in the wrong hands, this could be really bad.
Absolutely.
Like a lot of things. So how do you think? How can we how, like, if you were in a position to affect that, how would you solve that problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are already a number of organizations, some international, some national, that regulate the use of nuclear weapons. I know globally there's the INES, the International Nuclear Energy Society, and they maintain for example, an event scale that categorizes all the different incidents that can occur at a nuclear plant, 1 through 7, Fukushima and Chernobyl being the only Class 7 incidents that have ever occurred. I just knocked that clip off the thing. And yeah, so there are already regulatory structures in place to regulate the use of nuclear power systems, but yeah, obviously this is more suspect in countries like North Korea, Russia, and China, where we don't have the same oversight, same mutual oversight between allies that currently exists.
What led you to pick this topic?
I was told at the beginning of the thesis process, when we were supposed to pick our topic, you want to pick a topic that probably not everyone agrees with, but you also think can change the world. And I was thinking over what are the most high impact topics that I can talk about. I could talk about, pick a current events topic today, and I could have written on that. But I was like, okay, how many of these have this? What is the highest impact? What's the most important topic I think that I could discuss? It would really change things. And I thought that this was nuclear energy, from what I had researched previously, seemed like a massive game changer, and I thought this was the right topic to pick for me, especially.
You use the term energy and power interchangeably. Are those same concepts, or are they different concepts?
If I was writing this at a technical school, I would have got docked points for using that. Energy and power are not the same thing. Energy measured in joules, obviously power is, I believe, joule seconds. So scientifically, the terms are different. But what I say when I mean that is, for example, it's just wattage generated. So it's really all power, not energy. So energy, obviously, you can talk about the thermal energy that gets produced when a reactor is online. It's the same type of, use thermal energy in fossil fuel plants as well. You generate heat, the steam gets generated from the heat, and then that gets run through a turbine. Same in nuclear. You have a really hot reactor that heats water, turns to steam. So that's the energy portion of it, but power is really, when you're talking about efficiency, for example, you do need to make that delineation, because the actual power that's produced by the reactor helps determine how efficient the plant, or not just reactor, any plant, how effective that is.
So then, glad you recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for acknowledging. So then what is the real problem? Is the problem energy, or is the problem power?
Is the problem energy, or is it power? I think that right now the problem is power, because power is what we need to actually power, for example, your car, your phone, or your devices. You need electricity. So when I'm talking about power and whenever I'm using power and energy interchangeably, I'm specifically talking about electricity. So the amount of electricity being generated in watts usually. So terawatts, gigawatts. I don't usually talk about terawatts a lot because that's a ton of power, but yeah, so.
Okay. Which brings me to my next question, which is a lot of the misunderstanding around nuclear power, or nuclear energy. Right? And there's a distinction. Energy is a potential, power is the product. What is the fear that you explained in the paper stemming from? Is it because we can't control the beast, or is it because we don't know the beast, or is it because we are just afraid of the beast?
I think that the biggest of the three is that we are afraid of the beast. I think that with modern science and technology, we can control the beast. so to say. We know how to control these reactors, make them safe. We've designed reactors to make them safe over the years. If you have a really poor reactor design, obviously there's not a lot you can do as far as protocol to limit how bad it can get. See Chernobyl, that's how it all went wrong. But yeah, and then obviously I talk about molten salt reactors and how the design itself is just the mechanism of the design is enough to limit the potential dangers of the reactor.
Okay.
So
in your paper, and maybe if you come across this data, I didn't see it, and maybe if you did, then I missed it. How long has it taken in comparison for all different energy sources to stabilize so they were safely harvested to convert them into power? Do you have a comparison of it took X many years for this energy source, then it took X many years for this energy source, then it took X many years for this energy source?
no, I don't believe I looked across that data.
It didn't come across in the research.
I don't think I did look at that very much.
So if I were to give you that data today,
Mm-hmm.
if I were to tell you that it took for coal, for mankind to stabilize
Mhm.
coal as a source
Mm-hmm.
and convert that into power, it took 350 years.
Mm-hmm.
For mankind to take oil, which is the product, not the source of energy.
Mm-hmm.
The source is what happens under the crust of
Yeah.
the earth and all that. It took 700 years.
Mm-hmm.
Your argument is nuclear energy
Mm-hmm.
can be converted into nuclear power,
Yeah.
but we are barely 60 to 80 years into the experiment.
Yeah.
So it sounds very untested to me, the argument. So how would you make it a stronger argument?
As far as the
amount of time it took for mankind to experiment, to keep trying, to stabilize. So coal took 350
Mhm.
years, oil took over 700 years.
yes,
Nuclear is barely 60 to 80 years.
part of that I do think is that as we've gotten more advanced, the amount of time necessary to make these different technologies stable has sped up. We're better at we just know more now than we did obviously in 1755, and when coal and steam engines that were powering railways and industrial machinery was new. So I think that so far, 80 years, we have been able to do a lot to make nuclear plants much safer and to stabilize them as a source of power. We know a lot about how they function. We use AI now to manage the reactors themselves and to monitor all the different streams of data that's coming in from the sensors around the reactor to make sure that the correct number of control rods are in place at the right times and in the correct positions. So we've done a lot to, I think that at the moment, nuclear power is a very safe and stable energy source technologically, and there isn't a whole lot that we are kind of going out on a limb on. We're like, we think this works, and we're trying it out here, but we don't know how this could potentially go wrong. I think especially now that we've seen how it can go wrong, Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, I think we've done a good job and we've made it pretty stable. Obviously, I talk about the safety in my paper when I talk about the amount of people in an average town that would die over a course of, I don't know if it was a year or a decade, or I think it was per terawatt hour. So how many deaths per terawatt hour produced by a plant in an average town in America, and the number for nuclear was like 1 or whatever. It was minuscule compared to it was the lowest out of any of the sources. I can find the actual number in here for anybody who wants to actually hear the real numbers and rather than just take my word that it's so low. All right, so we can look right here. Yeah. So for example, in an average town populated by 27,000 people, 25 people would die annually if the town were coal powered. If it were natural gas, it would be 3 people. If instead the town was nuclear, 0.07 people would die annually. That number is so far below any of the other sources that I think the research would suggest that it's pretty safe as far as that goes and safe and stable.
I like that argument in the paper. I think that line of thinking was very good. Where I had challenge with was we have imperfect data. Mm-hmm. We have very less data. We may have 50 years, 100 years. We don't have 1,000 years data.
That is true.
Okay.
I guess on the heels of that is, I was reading the section where you were talking about how the how it can be made safer, essentially due to the intrinsic mechanism their design is built on. These reactors will not require redundant control, rod systems, or emergency cooling systems as the risk of meltdown is non-existent. So you kind of laid out like a picture of what the safe,
What could be.
what could be, right? So has anyone built one already?
Yes, so there have been experimental molten salt reactors that have been built. I believe the last time that the U.S. was experimenting with them was back in the 60s and 70s. But since then, China has been the world leader in molten salt reactor research. They have been investing heavily in it, so maybe that should tip us off. We should probably be doing it too. But yeah, no. Beyond that, I know the current challenges because obviously my research came across people that talked about why we shouldn't do molten salt reactors, and they talked about how it's an unproven technology and all those different things. I know the current challenges facing making a molten salt reactor practical for widespread implementation is primarily material science. So in the reactors, you need certain materials that are able to withstand higher loads of neutrons because it's not a slow spectrum reactor. So you need a different alloy, some newer alloys of metal we don't have currently, but I think we might have an idea of how we can get there, but it will take more research for us to get there. So it's not the immediate future. Molten salt reactors, we could start building them tomorrow. That isn't the case, but maybe give us a decade. I don't really know. I wasn't able to talk to somebody actually working on developing a molten salt reactor, but there are a number of private companies currently working on developing the technology necessary to make it an actual viable source. So
I was looking at, because that just reminded me of another question. I was looking at your resources, or your sources, and one of them was called Nuclear Power, Why Molten Salt Reactors Are Problematic, and kind of investing in them as a waste. What did you look for in the article? 'Cause that seems like it's talking about using that.
That's one of the sources I was talking about. I was talking about how some people are very against it. I know one of them was obviously it's current, just why we shouldn't invest in it because it's unproven. We don't know. And to that I say there are a ton of times in history where you have to invest a little bit to have the payoff later. So there are definitely a bunch of things, I could probably think of a number right now where we've invested heavily in things that you probably could have seen beforehand. It wouldn't have worked out, or it wouldn't have been, the return on investment would have been as good. But when I look at the potential that molten salt reactors provide, I'd say that the long-term return on investment to make them viable would be worth it in my book. So as far as the other reasons that they were against molten salt reactors, one of them was actually the possible, or what they saw as possible, dangers for proliferation of nuclear weapons, because molten salt reactors require higher amounts of enriched uranium-235, which is the necessary fuel to make a bomb. So obviously you don't want the technology to enrich uranium to that level to be given to other countries that don't have nuclear weapons programs currently. My response to that in the paper was that I actually thought that wouldn't be necessary. We could be the exporters of this material and keep the technology to ourselves. In fact, that strengthens the alliance relationship between our allies and us. They become more dependent on us for these programs. And then also it gives us more oversight over how they use the fuel because we're the purveyor, we're the one giving it to them. And then also that would then create an exclusion from other nations that would want to build nuclear molten salt reactors but wouldn't, because they wouldn't have the material to do so. Then they would have to come to the US, or they'd have to come to one of our allies that has a new weapons program, and then they'd have to buy it from them. So then that gives us leverage. So I think it doesn't necessarily mean we would have to export the technology. I think that actually plays into our hand.
Talking about classification of the information that it gets classified, that's part of keeping things safe. But who classifies the technology? The processes for this in our
Classifies, I mean, part of it is how it gets classified is you just don't give it. There are non-proliferation agreements that nations have signed already that, at least in written documents, prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And obviously, I don't think there's really no incentive for any of the nations that currently possess nuclear weapons to give that technology away for just deterrence reasons. So, yeah, that's more or less how it stays secret. Obviously, if somebody hacked into somebody, like spies, stole data on how to enrich uranium, like the Russians did in 1946 and 45, the end of World War II. That's obviously a problem. But that's just espionage. That's not deliberately handing the technology over to other nations.
So you make an argument that we have learned from the failures, right, in the paper, and you cite 3 of them. Do you think we have seen enough failures?
To never do it again, or
do you think we have seen enough failures in the experiment of nuclear power and nuclear energy and containing it and the aftermath and all that? Do you think we have seen enough to know we have learned enough, so now we can make it safe? Based on the research you've done.
Yeah. I think that, first off, we have learned a lot from these different failures. For example, Chernobyl, they didn't have a containment dome over the reactor module. The reactor, if it at any point were compromised, it would have been exposed to the open air, which it was. They didn't have sufficient control rods to control the reaction in the event of a meltdown. They just had enough to regulate it during normal operating procedures. And then they also didn't have a backup cooling system, or their backup cooling system was really weak. It wasn't well designed because I don't know, maybe they just didn't anticipate it ever getting to that point and they just were too confident. So obviously now regulations require that all of those things be present at a slow spectrum reactor. So and then Fukushima, they built the power plant right next to the water in a tsunami prone area, which is not ideal, just to put it that way.
I think the answer I was expecting was no.
Yeah.
To be honest, versus defending your paper, and here's the reason why. 3 failures is not enough. For the potential that nuclear energy carries, we need to see 100 failures. We need to see 1,000 failures. Before they make a needle for an injection, they go through tons and tons of tests and failures before they can certify a needle to inject something in a human body, because that needle can cause contamination. So I would encourage you to look harder through the data as a follow-up if you pick up this topic again in the future, right? And build a very solid case to say, how many failures do we actually need? Versus focusing on the success. Because that's the failures that have gone through in other energy sources that convert into power. And that's what I had a hint in the year's question, which is, in my opinion, as much as your paper has totally educated me and convinced me as a reader that we should explore nuclear power, I still don't feel safe, and here's why. I'm going to give you a statement, and I'm wondering, I'm just curious about your response, right?
All right.
I'm not critiquing or anything. The difference between coal and other energy sources, or solar, or wind, or algae-based energy.
Biofuels, yes.
Yeah, biofuel and others, is we are not manufacturing the raw ingredients. We are harvesting the raw ingredients, which has the potential of energy, and then we are converting that into power. In case of nuclear, we are actually manufacturing the raw ingredients, and then we are converting it into power. Right?
Yeah.
Controlling raw ingredients is something that humans haven't figured out yet, and that's why the failures, and that's why the risk of potential. So what will be your argument based on your research to say, look, this is the first energy source where we are creating the raw ingredients and then we are harvesting what comes out of it, versus all other energy sources that are stable?
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that even though it is relatively compared to the history of human power usage throughout all of time, the lifespan of nuclear has been very short. It's been less than 70 years. So yes, that is short compared to the grand scheme of energy usage. But I would say that based on the numbers we have, And I will clarify that the two major energy failures I talked about, Chernobyl and Fukushima, are not the only only nuclear incidents that have ever occurred. Obviously, I talked earlier about the INES scale from 1 to 7. There have been a number of incidents that have been below the 7 threshold. There are a ton that happen between 1, 2, and 3, and some of them happen every year. But these also get listed on everything from like a valve fails in a sprinkler system in the building, and that gets put on the event scale. So. We have had more than one failure, is what I'm trying to say. So it isn't like there have been 2 incidents where it's went wrong and it's been smooth sailing since then. No, there have been incidents throughout the history of nuclear where it has gone wrong, and we have had to learn from those. There have been a number of those. So it isn't quite, I don't know if it's quite 1,000. That would be pretty extreme over 60 years. 1,000 failures, that might not be very safe. But I do, the number is fairly low still. But yeah. And then to respond to the part where you talk about us manufacturing our own energy or power from this energy source, manufacturing the energy itself, is I don't think we should be afraid to try. So it is new, it's new territory, but then again, it's the return on investment. This is a opportunity that can change I talk in my opening introduction about how one of the lines I use is human civilization has always been marked and measured by the existing technology of the era. And more particularly, I say that, more or less, I'm not going to find it because that's too much work. I say that really that the epics of human technology have been defined by the energy that powers it. So you've got wind power and you've got fire, campfires that heat homes in ancient times, and then you've worked all your way up to coal. It starts the Industrial Revolution, and now we're at the point where we are, like you said, we're manufacturing our own energy for the first time ever. To go into the next era, we have to try. We have to improve in this area. And that isn't to say we're going into it blind. I think through 60 years, we have seen that it hasn't been very safe for the time period that's currently existed. We know more scientifically about the function of nuclear and how it works. We're developing new technologies that mitigate the risks even more. So I think that I will not deny that the risks exist and that there is unknown. Obviously, I don't think there's any unknown. We can't be too confident in our knowledge because, as Einstein said, the larger your knowledge expands. If you imagine it to be a sphere, the surface area gets bigger the larger the volume gets. So you're more in contact with the unknown than you were before. So I will definitely concede that. But I think that the risks are vastly outweighed by the benefits here.
During the whole research, was there a moment of frustration where you said, why are we not doing this already? Why is solar getting 1.7%?
Yeah, absolutely. And you just look at how much investment, it's crazy.
And like, I want to run for Congress and fix this.
Yeah, there were definitely moments where I was like, I can't believe that this here is going on still. And again, I wrote in the beginning, I wanted to write on a topic that I thought would change the world. And this was kind of, there are definitely moments like that. How could I not?
We were talking about history shows the future age will only be as bright as the energy that powers it. Is that what, I think that is right too. I think you repeated that like 3 times in different ways.
I'm sure I did.
So, well, actually, I was going to say, I appreciate how your thesis was very clearly stated and you kept coming back to it through your whole paper. So I was refreshed in what your thesis, what is this all about? And so I think you did a really good job. And stating your thesis at the beginning and like infusing it through the whole paper was very well laid out. And just those little things that you repeated about the future being bright, it's like you kept coming back to that. Mm-hmm. And actually, isn't that how people get indoctrinated these days in anything, right? You keep hearing it and hearing it on the media, on social media, whether it's like, Greta Thunberg doing her speeches and it's everywhere. And so now the young people think Greta Thunberg is an expert at this, right?
Yeah.
So how,
literary
so
devices.
obviously, I mean, you're young, but you're very knowledgeable in a very like complicated subject, right? This is I mean, like there are politicians still like arguing about this stuff, right? Scientists, but so what, but I know you said you picked it because you wanted to pick something that would change the world. And obviously, this is the big one, right? It's a hot topic. Elon Musk is making electrical cars. He's the richest man in the world, and so he has a lot of influence now, especially now that he's bought Twitter, right?
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
he can actually start he can use that as a platform too.
So I just go DM him.
Yeah. So what do you think is another barrier besides, like you said, we should elect politicians that are for nuclear energy. So how do you think, besides making people aware of this subject, what is another way to start people thinking on the path of nuclear energy?
I will definitely say that this was probably, of all the things in my thesis, talking about what we should actually do about this was one of the least well thought out things in the entire thing. That was more or less my goal in the thesis, was more to convince people why it's such a good thing, and then explain as thoroughly as possible just all the particulars related to that. So I will say that up front, admit that my response for how we should respond to this is not as complete as I would like it to be. So all that kind of came to mind initially was just kind of like, well, just tack this on. It's just talk to your politicians, your congressmen or whatever. But really, we've seen a lot recently, and there's like, for example, the commercial space race where private companies have been really, they've been towing the line and pushing the envelope as far as innovation in these areas. And I think that for nuclear, that could very much be the same. I don't know exactly how you could, probably not going to be donating to these companies. They're for-profit corporations. I don't even know if that's illegal. But yeah, definitely spreading awareness is great. And so is writing to politicians, maybe speaking on, obviously there are TED Talks on this that you can go watch. Schellenberger has a really good one. So beyond that, maybe the answer I can give so far is just be educated and make it a priority when you're talking about, politicians for the future and voting on policies for or against this.
There is a cost to making power available to the masses.
Mm-hmm.
Based on your research, or did you come across any research or data? You mentioned it a little bit, but you didn't go into too much detail on how much it would cost us to harvest nuclear energy and convert it into power, or manufacture nuclear energy and convert it into power. What would be the comparison compared to other sources? Like, is the cost? I saw some data there, but I'm just trying to get a little deeper.
Are you talking specifically about like the levelized cost of energy, the LCOE?
The world runs on making money.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Energy is the largest source of making money.
Mm-hmm.
There is no logic in how much we pay for energy. There is absolutely no logic. We pay what people decide we should pay.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, current gas prices.
Yeah.
So it has no barrier to the cost of generating that power.
Yeah.
Why do you think nuclear energy hasn't received
the same amount of, like, for example, subsidies?
So much acceptance in the industrial mind, people who make money? Why haven't they latched on to this? What is it that they know that we don't know?
Is it that they don't? I know for one, there are a lot of nuclear-specific taxes that the government puts on nuclear companies, and also on I know the U.S. currently, we have to import a lot of our uranium from other countries. We have drastically scaled down our mining of uranium resources, which doesn't make much sense to me at all, but we have still done that. So obviously when you're importing, you're dealing with tariffs, and I know, and part of it has also been, for companies that are trying to invest right now in energy sources, a lot of that comes from subsidies. And right now, nuclear is not the most subsidized energy source. So even if on its own, it stands as a really, really good as an economically great option to generate power. Obviously the LCOE at 3% discount rate, it's amazing. It's the most economically viable energy source we have. But that doesn't take into account subsidies and taxes, and all of that is currently working in Renewable's favor right now. Renewable's favor, and then for more long-standing, oil and gas have had more subsidies. So I don't think nuclear is being subsidized as much.
So I think the reason why I asked that question is, in your paper you could have converted that argument into a much stronger point. So if you end up working on this in the future, right? Because what appeals to policymakers and people who think about policy is the economic models. Because at the end of the day, the government and the policymakers and decision makers make decisions based on three things: jobs, which is my last question, jobs, second, cost, and third, profit.
Yep.
And smart people who got solar energy funded and wind energy funded, despite the output, is they did those three things right. They said solar will create jobs, solar will cost us less, and solar will give us profit. Right? So take those three dimensions into account as you think about future focus, right? Which brings to my last question. If you were the head of the Department of Energy for the United States, and you had unlimited budget to invest in nuclear energy and harvesting, where would you invest the most?
Fusion research. So I don't talk a whole ton about, well, I would invest in building fission plants, normal nuclear plants. So that means I would probably shift funding away. I would start shifting the subsidies that are currently funding utility scale solar and wind projects in the United States. I would start funneling that into building nuclear plants. And then my second consideration would be, the second priority would be putting money into fusion research. If you just tell me that I have an unlimited budget for research, that immediately tells me, okay, I'm putting $1 trillion, for example, or however much is necessary into making fusion viable, because part of what makes fusion research so difficult is that it is wildly expensive. I think ITER currently is pulling in like $100 billion per year. It's an international organization and it still costs that much. So, I don't know. But that's neither here nor there.
Answering really technical questions. I knew he was going to have those questions because he comes and speaks to my class once in a while, challenge one, and challenges
I
us very well.
really
But
appreciate
anyways,
it.
You did a really good job thinking
Thank
on your
you.
feet, and I can tell that you're very knowledgeable. You've studied this very well. So congratulations, excellent job.
Thank you.
And my last question was, what are you thinking of studying in college?
You're gonna be very surprised by this, but architecture and engineering. So like nothing like this for some reason. I just found it very interesting.
You did a good job on the paper. Congratulations. Your research was thorough and you answered questions really well. And I think the big takeaway for me is just I learned a whole lot about nuclear energy and nuclear power. So
It's
thank
awesome.
you for doing that. And I love your passion and your emotion came out from the paper. We are human beings. We should be emotional in what we write. We are not writing a Congress bill. So thank you. That was also emotional when they wrote Obamacare. That's why it's such a mess. So, but thank you for doing this. And what I would say is, always think about the analogy of a tree. If you had unlimited budget, you would actually plant the seeds because you won't be alive to see the fruit. And that's how long I think it's going to take us to tap the potential of nuclear energy. So again, great answer, and thank you for everything you did. And
Thank you.
yeah.